r/NoSleep. Posted by u/withywoodwitch. When my grandfather died, I accidentally discovered a family secret. I wish I hadn't. My grandma died when I was little. I don't remember much about her apart from the vaguest memories. She always wore flowery dresses, and she always fed me treats when my mother wasn't looking. My grandpa never remarried. My mother always said it was because he loved his wife so much that nobody would be able to take her place. When I got older, I found this both heartbreaking and romantic. Grandma had her own room. Grandpa said it was because he snored so much they had to sleep separately. When she died, he locked her room up, and it was the only place in the house we were not permitted to go. Sometimes we would try to peep through the keyhole, but someone would always scream about seeing a ghost and we would all run away. I don't think Grandpa was lonely, we were a big part of his life. He lived close by, so we all piled into his house regularly, filling his house with noise and life. I would play in his garden with my cousins whilst the adults talked and cooked. In the summer, the garden bloomed with the flowers my grandma had loved, hydrangeas being her favorite. In the winter, it was hung with balls of fattened birdseed, and the bird feeder was always fully stocked. My grandma had loved birds, Grandpa said, and always worried that they wouldn't have enough to eat when the weather got colder. I was, unofficially, my grandpa's favorite. He would bounce me on his knee and sing a song about my name that I didn't understand but thought was hilarious. Lily the Pink. I took to wearing pink whenever I visited. He took over my grandma's job of handing out treats to all of us, cautioning us not to tell our parents, although I'm sure our parents knew full well what was going on from the telltale smears of chocolate around our mouths. He was a gentle, mild man who hardly ever raised his voice. The only time I can ever remember him being slightly angry is when my brother Craig and I were fighting. Craig had kicked me in the leg hard enough to leave the print of his shoe sole on me, and Grandpa had almost shouted then. Unused to Grandpa scolding us, Craig had started to cry, and Grandpa had taken him aside and given him a long, serious talk about the importance of family. "You never hurt family," he had told him. "Your family is important." Craig always treated me pretty well after that. When Grandpa grew frail, he needed more help. As his favorite, it naturally fell to me to take on part of his care. I shared my duties with a home carer, although they weren't really duties as I loved him so much. I would have done anything for Grandpa. His mind remained mostly sharp, with occasional lapses that he referred to as senior moments. Sometimes he would call me by my mother's name, but he would always correct himself. When he became seriously ill, I quit my job to be his full-time carer. Being put in a nursing home was Grandpa's biggest fear, and he made me promise over and over again that I wouldn't allow that to happen. "I can't leave her," he said. "She's still here. We said till death do us part and I'm not dead yet." Even as an adult I was not allowed into her room. He told me he had kept it exactly the same as the day she had died, a shrine to her memory. He got weak. He couldn't eat unless I spoon-fed him. The nurse who visited every day fitted him with a catheter and told me he should really be in a hospice, but I ignored her. If he wanted to die at home, I would honor my promise to let him do so. He liked to talk to me. He reminisced about the day he had met my grandma, the day each grandchild was born. He loved having so many grandchildren, he told me. He loved to see us thrive, and mourned the fact that he wouldn't live to see his great-grandchildren. My eldest cousin was pregnant, but it was doubtful he would be alive by the time she gave birth. He never got sad, he had lived a very full life, and a happy one. But he did get anxious, although he said he wasn't afraid to die. He said it was what might come after that worried him. He spent his last days barely aware of what was going on around him. Family visited, staying as long as they could, and sometimes his small, modest room was packed with people, spilling from the doorway. The kettle was never cold, the house never empty. Except for the night he finally died. I was with him, along with my mother and aunt. They had fallen asleep in their chairs, their genteel snores the only sound in the room besides the ticking of Grandpa's old clock and the slow, labored breaths of my grandpa. He regained consciousness briefly before he died, and though I might have woken my mother and aunt so they could share, some selfish instinct stopped me from doing so. I knew, you see, and I wanted this moment to be my own. His eyes were bleary but they managed to focus on me. His cheeks twitched as he tried to muster a smile. "Lily the Pink," he whispered. I whispered back. "Yes, it's me." "I'm sorry," he said. I took the gnarled hand that lay on the covers. His fingers were cold. "You don't have to apologize, Grandpa," I told him. I wanted to cry, but he had always hated to see me cry. "Yes I do. He sank back on his pillow, the exchange clearly exhausting him. "I'm sorry for what comes after," he said. "You never hurt family. Family is important." He died then, and that was when I allowed myself to cry. I would miss him, but I couldn't be sad for him. He was going to see Grandma after all these years. I imagined him strong again, walking into a white light and emerging on the other side to a garden where flowers always bloomed and the birds were always singing, my grandma waiting at the end of the path. As with his care, it fell mostly to me to clear out his house. I had help on the evenings and weekends, but most of the time it was just me. His room was the hardest for me to do, and I cried often as I worked. It would have been poetic if the clock in his room had stopped ticking when he died, but it continued to tick in defiance of my wishes, a constant background to my chore. I boxed everything up, sealing and labeling my grandpa's life. Everything he had experienced was being compartmentalized into what was of value and what was not. The richness and experience of his life had been reduced to odds and ends to be sorted to put away. I sorted things for charity, heirlooms to be shared out amongst the rest of the family, memories to be stored away in an attic. Everything I picked up had some kind of significance, whether it was the everyday detritus of his life or the mementos of his history. A pen he would never write with again, a book he hadn't finished reading, these things were just as poignant as his medals and his photographs. There were old love letters from my grandma, souvenirs from holidays, pictures we had painted for him, birthday cards we had sent. And finally, in the depths of an old, dented tobacco tin, buried beneath old cinema ticket stubs and faded postcards, the key to my grandma's room. It felt almost sacrilegious to go in there after all these years, yet the morbid fascination with Grandma's room had stayed with me since I was a child and I couldn't have kept out even if I hadn't had a job to do. From the way Grandpa had spoken about her presence in the house, I almost expected to open the door and find her there, either as a desiccated corpse stretched out on the bed or as a taxidermied mummy propped up in a chair. She wasn't, of course. The room was empty of life, and death, and had been for decades. It smelled stale in there, as was to be expected, and slightly sweet with an old scent that might have been violets and might have been roses. It was a very feminine room. The wallpaper bore the same floral motif she had favored on her dresses. Grandpa had kept the curtains closed, so it hadn't faded, apart from a narrow stripe from a persistent sunbeam that angled towards the narrow bed. My first thought as I walked in was that it felt like a stage set. As if every item in the room was a prop. Had she died in here? I couldn't remember what I had been told. I found myself looking for signs of her passing, a life interrupted on the spot. As with my grandpa's room, I didn't know where to start. But this time it was because everything was so familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. There were memories to be found here, as buried as the key to her room had been. The first thing I did was to pull open the curtains. With some natural light in there, everything felt a little more real, and I was able to look around without the feeling of dissociation I'd felt upon entering. I couldn't tackle her room that day. It was too soon. I wanted the chance to remember more, to explore, and to reconnect with the woman who had sat me on her knee. How could I discover this unknown life and collapse it all in the same day? Even though she had died long ago, it still felt like trying to go through her personal items. I sifted through her belongings with less sentimentality but more curiosity than I had with my grandpa's room. A beloved life was stored within these walls, but one I had barely any memory of, so whilst everything I picked up had a story behind it, I did not know what it was. There was a pegboard on one wall with baby booties hung on it. I counted them, and they matched the number of grandchildren in the family. Grandma had, apparently, kept a pair from each of us. We were represented too in framed photos, both on the wall and on her dressing table, alongside perfume bottles from which the contents had long since evaporated, and old cosmetics with faded labels. There was also a jewelry box on her dressing table that drew my attention. Mother of pearl was inlaid on the lid, and it was cracked open, with a string of amber beads spilling out. That jewelry box summoned a stubborn memory, of sitting on the knee of a woman who wore flowers and smelled like flowers, and sifting through the contents. The jewelry inside was all cheap stuff, but it was colorful and sparkling, something that would have fascinated younger me. I was allowed to choose anything, she said. Any piece I wanted. There was a butterfly brooch that I suddenly recalled pinned to her dress, right in the center of a printed flower as though it had landed there to drink nectar. I had a whole box of cut-price finery to choose from, but for some reason that brooch stood out. "You want this? Are you sure?" I saw a hand unpinning the brooch and carefully tucking the point away before it was handed to me. It was made from enamel with colored glass and expertly mounted on the wings, a bit of pretty rubbish really, but it was the only thing I wanted. Whatever had happened to that brooch? I drifted through her room slowly, examining everything until the sky began to darken. The room had felt tranquil whilst the sunlight had flooded it, but as the shadows began to grow I started to feel unsettled. As a child I had been afraid of the dark. Maybe those feelings were resurfacing because I had been a child the last time I was in here. Whatever the reason, I left the room and locked the door back up again. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke often, plagued by nightmares, and was unable to settle again until I gave in to my old fears and turned on a lamp. In one dream, I was unlocking the door to Grandma's room and there was a scuffing sound from within. I opened the door just in time to see something crawl under the bed. It was dragging a pair of malformed, not quite human feet behind it. In another, I was trying to open the wardrobe door but I couldn't. It didn't feel as though the door was locked, but more like someone was holding it closed from the inside. When I did finally open it, my first action was to plunge my hand in between the hanging dresses. I felt something cold and papery and lumpy that might have been a face. It split open in the seconds before I woke, and I felt teeth against my fingertips. The final dream had Grandpa in it. He looked as he did the moment before he died, but he was standing in front of Grandma's door, barring the way. He was unresponsive, his face blank and inanimate, eyes lifeless. I could not bring myself to move him. My nightmares lingered the next day, and it was hard for me to unlock the door to Grandma's room. There was a feeling of foreboding quite aside from the normal trepidation I'd felt the first time. I heard no noises, saw no horrible creature scrabble beneath her bed, and, as I'd left the curtains open the day before, sunlight dispelled any shadows. It was a pleasant room, and I relaxed once I was inside. Dreams were my mind's way of sorting through information, and I couldn't let them affect me. I started my work slowly, emptying Grandma's wardrobe one dress at a time. I folded each one with reverence. Even though I remembered little of her, she deserved as much respect as Grandpa had. There were fur coats wrapped in plastic, and I didn't know what to do with them. I went through the pockets of each before putting them in a separate box. I found a handkerchief in one, a spent lipstick tube and an old penny in another. She had many handbags too, and I found more outdated currency in there. In a small, sequined evening bag I found a tiny key, and set it aside in case I found what it belonged to. Around lunchtime, some family members came by to help. For whatever reason, I found myself locking up Grandma's room and pocketing the key, unwilling to let them into our secret. And it did feel like a secret. We hefted boxes and loaded cars together, but all the while I was wishing they would leave so I could carry on my exploration. I slept in the narrow bed in the little room I'd adopted since Grandpa had become ill. I hadn't slept easy since I'd ventured into Grandma's room, though I had always slept well before. I had black nightmares, full of terror and confusion that would wake me up in a sweating mess. I started to sleepwalk, something I hadn't done since I was a child. I often woke up trying to turn the handle to my Grandma's room, and would run back to my own bed in childish terror. When I woke up, I would wash and dress and eat breakfast, then go back into her room as if those dreams had never happened. I cleared her room slowly and painstakingly. I was looking for the tawdry butterfly brooch that Grandma had once given me, on the off chance it had found its way back to her room. It had a familiar yet uncomfortable association that wouldn't leave me alone. I dreamed about that brooch. It had been a bad dream, but much more innocent than the others. I dreamed about wearing the brooch on my t-shirt, and someone unpinning it. Grandpa had been the one to unpin it. He had seen me wearing it and his face had clouded for a second, something dark behind his eyes. "Did your grandma give you that?" I felt scared. I thought he was accusing me of stealing it, and I started to cry. He picked me up, kissed my forehead and patted my back. But he took the brooch off me nevertheless. I felt terrible in the dream, as though I'd disappointed him, and I never wanted to disappoint Grandpa. He laughed and squeezed me tight, called me a silly sausage, told me I hadn't done anything wrong. But it didn't help. I had evidently done something wrong. It was right there on his face. There were raised voices. I was alone. I stood outside a closed door, listening, the doorknob far above my head. What had I done and why was Grandpa angry? I left Grandma's jewelry box till last. Everything else had been labeled and packed, but I hadn't been able to put that away yet. I'd been half hoping the butterfly brooch would suddenly appear in there if I looked often enough. I don't know why I wanted it so much. Maybe just to validate my memory. I packed the jewelry box with the rest of the heirlooms. I was exhausted. I wanted nothing more to do with my grandma's room. It was stripped bare, aside from the large items of furniture, and the British Heart Foundation were coming tomorrow to take those away. I was done. We don't take mattresses." I was haggard from lack of sleep, and as far as I was concerned the man could have been speaking a foreign language. He must have seen my confusion, because he elaborated. "We'll take the bed frame, but you'll have to dispose of the mattress yourself. Not hygienic. People won't buy a used mattress." I shrugged. "Okay. Take the rest then. I'll deal with what's left." He nodded. I turned aside and went to my little room with its narrow bed. I had no wish to see these strangers tramping through my grandpa's home, stripping it of everything I had ever known, peeling it back to an ordinary house. I heard the men bantering as they moved the furniture, laughing amongst themselves, talking about what they'd watched on TV the night before. They didn't mean any harm, but their levity was grating. It was only when it came to moving Grandma's old bed frame that the chatter stopped. A man came to my room and knocked on my door. "Excuse me? There's something you missed when you were clearing out. Some kind of box. I thought you might want it." I opened the door. The man held a large wooden box, inset with a tiny brass keyhole. It looked expensive, almost definitely an antique, and I admired his honesty. "It was under the bed in the flowery room," he said. "Couldn't see it unless you crawled under there, to be honest. Looks important though." I thanked him in earnest, thinking about his words as I closed the door on the clamor that had restarted. It had been under my grandma's bed, and I couldn't have seen it unless I'd crawled under. Of course my mind returned to my dreams, and the thing which had scuttled under my grandma's bed. But it also returned to a tiny key I recalled finding. In a pocket? A handbag? What had I done with that? The men had been forbidden to take any box marked with an X, and after they had gone I ventured out and began to search. It was in one of the boxes, I was sure. I dug through each one as efficiently as I could, taking care not to disrupt the order I had created. There were countless odd receptacles in each box, any one of them possibly containing the key to the polished wooden box in my room, but twilight reached me before I found my prize, and I ate a solemn, solo dinner before retiring for the night. I read a book, on a mattress on the floor of my room, by the light of a bare bulb, before finally falling asleep. The dream I had that night was just as disturbing as all the others, if not more. In it, I was searching the house for the key still, rummaging through boxes upon boxes, but in each one all I found was knitted baby booties, filled to the brim. Every box I emptied made my anxiety grow, but I persevered, piling the booties in a corner of my grandma's room until they nearly reached the ceiling. Just before I woke up, I found myself spiraling through the bare rooms, frantic at all the empty boxes, but there was one in my grandpa's room I hadn't opened. This was probably due to the figure crouched beside it, a hunched-over thing that might have been an item of furniture but which I somehow knew it was not. And although I very much wanted to look in that final box, I didn't want to go near its apparent guardian. When I woke up, Grandpa's room was the first place I went. It was full of boxes waiting to be distributed amongst the family, but there was one in the corner I recognized from my dream. There was no hunched figure crouched beside it, but I still felt uneasy when I approached. This box was labeled? Which was what I'd put on anything that wasn't immediately identifiable, and I started to sift through the contents. It was the work of a few minutes to find the tiny key, which I had sealed into an envelope marked keys. I had labeled so many things whilst clearing the house it was no wonder I didn't quite recall labeling this one. I took the key back to my room and unlocked the box. There was no ceremony to it. I might have been about to uncover a deeply hidden family secret, but there was no thunder and lightning to accompany my discovery. The box was full of newspaper, yellowed and fragile with age. It wasn't preserved for any historical reason, as it was all crumpled up, not folded. It looked more like it was there to serve as packing material. I dug down into the box, pulling out the newspaper. I was expecting documents, or photos, or an old diary entry or two, but it won't surprise you much that I discovered an old brooch nestled in the bottom. I found I wasn't surprised either. Part of me had expected it. What I hadn't expected, however, was that the brooch did not depict a butterfly, as I remembered. It was vaguely butterfly-shaped, with wings, and the color scheme was familiar enough that I recognized it, but whatever creature it had been created to resemble was not anything I had seen in nature. It was just as garish and crude as I remembered, but the clumsiness of its design seemed deliberate rather than due to lack of skill. Despite being a physical object, the lines blurred together in an odd optical illusion so that no matter how much I stared at it, it never quite came into focus, and seemed to change whenever I turned it. I put the brooch in my pocket. Family members would be arriving soon to move boxes, and I didn't want them to see the brooch. Also, looking at it gave me a curiously queasy feeling, as though I were about to get a migraine. We worked all day. At the end of it, the house was empty but for my belongings and my mattress, and my mother asked if I would be going home. She had assumed I would, but I did not want to. I felt like there was unfinished business here. One more night. I was so tired I fell asleep without difficulty. I had looked at the brooch again before turning out the light, but couldn't make any more sense of it. I left it on the narrow ledge of the windowsill next to me and drifted back into the familiar realm of my troubled dreams. "You want this? Are you sure?" I was little again, sat on Grandma's lap. The jewelry box was open on my own lap, forgotten. The brooch on her dress was far more fascinating. I had remembered this part, but there was more that I hadn't, and it rolled out obligingly from me now. "Choose something else, darling," said Grandma. "This is for grown-ups." "I want that." My tears had been easy. I wasn't used to Grandma telling me no. "Please, Lily. Anything else. Anything you want." There had been more cajoling, but I had been an expert manipulator as a child, and I could sense Grandma's resolve weakening. I sulked and pouted and begged and cried until she caved in, but even then there was hesitation as she unpinned the brooch. "You could have chosen anything," she said. "But here. It's yours." I clutched it in my fist, gazing with fascination at the funny face the thing had. "Butterfly." Yes. Butterfly. Pretty butterfly. "Come on now, Lily. Would you like a cake? Grandma has baked some." My mother, looking horrified when I showed her. "Oh my God, Mum. Why has she got that monstrosity? Lily, give it back, it's ugly." But I would not give it back. It was mine. I had won it through determination. My grandmother hung her head. "She wanted it," she said. Grandpa spotted it next. He looked angry. I thought he was angry at me for nagging Grandma, but he was kind to me. Unpinned the brooch, took it away. I followed him discreetly and listened at Grandma's bedroom door as they argued within, the doorknob far above my head. Their voices were muffled but I could make out the odd word. "You don't hurt family," Grandpa was saying. "Hilda, I love you. But not Lily. She's a child. We said no children. And not family." More indistinct words. It sounded like my grandmother was crying. "I'm so tired." "Asked for it." Begged. I put my cheek against the door to listen closer, clumsy little kid skull bunking off the wood, and the voices inside stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" I didn't wait to see if either of them had. I ran away, into the garden, to play with my cousins. I remembered all of it now, but still none of it made sense. I think I was awake. I could feel the pillow beneath my head, the covers on top of me. There was even a tickle in my nose that had been a constant companion since starting all the dusty work I had done. I had to be awake. But my bedroom door was open, when I knew I had closed it. From where I was lying I had a clear view down the hall. Nearest, and to the left was Grandma's room. Then Grandpa's room. Straight ahead was the bathroom, and to the right the stairs. There was a broad stripe of moonlight cutting across the banister from the small window by the stairs, and it hit Grandma's bedroom door with unnerving accuracy. I had shut her door and locked it, a ritual I never neglected. And I was glad I had, because in the depths of the customary nighttime silence I thought I heard the creak of boards in her room. I closed my eyes. Tried to go back to sleep. There might have been the merest judder of the floor beneath my mattress, transferred from the long boards that made up the top floor of the house. But that was likely just my imagination. I listened to my own breathing. It was loud inside my head, and very nearly blotted out the noise which was becoming more noticeable the more I ignored it. A dragging sound. The sound of something that wanted to be heard, but was pretending it didn't. A crafty noise, a sniggering under the breath. Slow and laborious, and getting closer. I thought of old childhood songs, hymns I had sung when I was little inside a large echoing room where we had assembly. We'd been taught kiddie Christian songs, about Jesus being a light and how autumn reminded us of God. I tried to remember the words. Anything rather than acknowledge what I was hearing. It was louder now. More insistent. It sounded like the door handle to Grandma's room was rattling. I didn't open my eyes, because I didn't want to see if I was right. And anyway, the door was locked. No point in ruining my sleep and seeing something upsetting but harmless. Autumn days when the grass is jeweled and the silk inside a chestnut shell, jet planes waiting in the air to be refueled, all these things I love so well. So I mustn't forget. Not I mustn't forget. To say a great big thank you, I mustn't forget. The next verse had mentioned bacon, I was sure of it. The smell of bacon. I didn't want to hear what I heard, The door I had locked opening with a scream of complaining hinges that almost sounded human. The thud of something soft hitting the floor. I opened my eyes then. It was a mistake. There was a fat shadow outside Grandma's room, part of it obscured by the doorway. It had no real form, but it undulated where it lay, hunching up into a rounder shape. It reminded me of a cocoon, as if something was struggling inside to get out. A thin outer membrane bulging from within. It pulled itself from the doorway, and now I had seen it, I was powerless to look away. I couldn't even close my eyes. I saw all of it, in whatever form it chose to show. The end of it tapered into something that could have been legs, although they tapered into points that in no way resembled feet. There were small nubs there, but they waved in the air uselessly as it shuffled along on bent, sharply angular joints that might have been knees. It started to pull itself along the bare boards, unsheathing claws from the folds of itself, digging them into the wood and dragging its body forward. Scrape by scrape, it was coming towards me. Was this sleep paralysis? It made sense. I'd heard all about it, and it certainly fit the description. I couldn't move, and I was seeing something that couldn't possibly have been there. As it got closer, I could hear the raspy sounds of its breath. It was damp and bubbly, choked and phlegmy. It sounded like it was drowning, and I wished it would do so before it reached me. A face was becoming visible under the cowl of skin or cloth hanging over the front of the thing, but I had no wish to see it. It crawled with steady menace, broaching the threshold of my room and not stopping till it was within touching distance. I could not close my eyes, but I willed them to unfocus. There were tiny muscles I was still able to command, and I used them, blurring the face getting close to mine. Letting my gaze drift. It smelled like mold and old spunk and wet dust. If cobwebs had a smell we could detect, they would smell like this, I thought. A scaly hand touched my arm, scrabbled across my chest. It had a weight that belied its skeletal appearance. It used that hand to heave itself on top of me, and I let my eyes roll back into my head. I did not want to see its face. I felt its bulk settle against my ribs. A pressure like a cement block crushing my lungs. It was panting now, breath that should have been hot but was icy cold stinging the skin of my face. I thought about the smell of bacon as it fastened its lipless mouth over mine and started to suck. I must have passed out, or fallen asleep. Or switched to another dream. I don't quite know which reality was true. I was dazed and lightheaded when I came to myself, sucking in air with a pair of lungs that felt flat and rubbery and stupid. I couldn't take a deep enough breath to satisfy me. The thing was gone, if it had ever been there, but in its place I felt a gentle pressure near my feet that was enough to make me crane my head towards it. There was a man sitting on my mattress, legs folded awkwardly, but I felt no fear. I recognized my grandpa from photos in which he was younger. He looked very sad. "I'm sorry, Lily," he told me. "I tried to get rid of it, but she wouldn't let me. I wanted to hide it better, but I didn't know I was going to get ill so quickly. I tried to sit up, but I was so weak my arms collapsed underneath me." I heard Grandpa click his tongue in sympathy. "Poor girl," he said. "It's not pleasant, I know. She told me all about it. Decades, it followed her. Sometimes she could get rid of it for years, other times only days. Wore her out." He patted my leg. I could feel it through my blanket. "She never meant to pass it to you. We had an agreement, no kids, no family. She swore. But she got tired." He leaned over, and I managed to raise my head enough to see him. His eyes were wet, but whilst they offered empathy there was no real help there. "I can't stay long. They'll notice I'm gone. But get yourself some oxygen. You'll need it in the mornings. Take a sip or two when you wake up. It's yours now, so take it as much as you can. Pass it on if you feel you're able. You probably won't feel like you can now, but a few years down the line you might change your mind. It weighs on the soul," she said. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask him so much more, but I didn't have the energy. And he was looking scared now. "I have to go. They're looking for me. I'm so sorry, Angel. Just remember what I said. His emblem guides him. He has to follow. But he always returns once the soul has gone. Sleep right, Lily the Pink." He left then. Left in an unimpressive fizzle of air occupying the space where he had been. And I was alone with a new dilemma. So far, I have decided that I will take the creature for as long as I can. After that, who knows? Somebody has to own it.